Throughout this course, we have learned many things about different forms of democracy, different forms of governments, and one thing I've learned is that there are vast differences between the ways that the US functions as a government and the rights that it gives its citizens, and the way that other governments functions, even other governments that are democracies, and the rights that they give their citizens. For one simple example, the US has the Second Amendment and other rights that the UK and other European countries don't have, yet both these countries are democratic countries. So, what is one or some of the essential rights that citizens must possess for a country to be a functioning democracy? And not only a functioning democracy, but that one is that is well functioning and flourishing and an example to other countries. One of the key and cornerstone rights that a country must possess to be a well functioning democracy is a right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Now, whenever that right was coined in the Bill of Rights, it was a much more limited right, as there was no internet, social media wasn't a thing. It was strictly verbal, actions that one could take, and things that one could write. But today, there's social media, which has completely changed the landscape of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Now, freedom of speech is one of those rights that many people agree with, that they agree that it should be a thing, but it can become a very controversial right whenever it gets to what limits should be placed on freedom of speech. Now, let's begin with just looking at a couple of the benefits that everybody agrees on whenever it comes to freedom of speech, or at least the vast majority of people agree on. The majority of people agree that freedom of speech is essential for a democracy, as it allows discussion of different ideas, compromise. It allows people to disagree with the government, to disagree with one another on different social issues, political issues. Without the freedom of speech, a country would never change. A country would most likely stay stagnant, change would be slow, or change would go with whoever controlled and had the most power at that time. People would not have a voice to guide where the country was going or to change the minds of their neighbors, political leaders, and different people in the government. And for this reason, many people are strong supporters of freedom of speech and believe that it is a necessary thing. But whenever you start to get into other areas of freedom of speech, should all forms of speech or all forms of expression, all forms of social media posts, should these things be allowed? Or should they be punishable by government intervention? And that is a difficult and controversial question, because there's such things as racial language, sexual harassment, verbal harassment, discriminatory language. These are just a few things that the average person would disagree with as being wrong and not socially acceptable, but how those things are defined or how those things are enforced can be a very difficult subject and leads to lots of controversy. A Pew Research article in 2015 found that in general, Americans are by far more supportive of controversial forms of free speech, whether that's offensive language of religions, minority groups, whatever it may be. Americans are generally more acceptable of offensive language. So it begs the question, how and what limits should be placed on language? Scholars at the University of Stanford in the philosophy department have made this statement regarding the subject. The task, therefore, is not to argue for an unlimited domain of free speech. Such a concept cannot be defended. Instead, we need to decide how much value we place on speech in relation to other important ideals, such as privacy, security, democratic equality, and prevention of harm. And they make it very clear that there's no such thing as a complete unlimited range of free speech. That would be a chaotic world and a very dangerous place to live. So the question is, what should be limited and how should it be limited? Now, I want to say that, in my opinion, there's not one clear-cut right answer. This is very much a gray issue where there's answers that are more right than other answers, but there's not one clear-cut answer. And the principle that I found to be the most helpful and instructional for this topic is called the Mill Principle. And the Mill Principle states that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent the harm to others. And although this principle is not perfect, I believe that it does the best job of all the principles there are. But interpretation of this principle comes down to one word. How do you interpret the word harm? And I would like to propose that there are three areas or spheres of influence that harm encompasses. The first is physical harm, whenever words are used to call for an attack on certain individuals. Economic harm, defaming someone's reputation to cause economic consequences. And the third one is verbal harassment in an unescapable situation. Whenever a person is not freely able to leave the verbal harassment or others are not able to defend them, I believe that a limit should be placed and that free speech should be constrained in those circumstances. And although these principles are not perfect and it leaves some areas, I believe that it is the best case that we have to allow freedom of speech, but also to avoid some of the unideal consequences to it. Thank you.